Hi everyone, welcome to the January 25th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are taking a look back at the major racing from last week around the country. Craig, the focus obviously on the fairgrounds last weekend. We covered those stakes races on the TimeformUS forecast last week. The major headline attractions on that card being the Lecomte, the early Derby prep for the 3-year-olds, and that Louisiana Stakes, which featured the return as 4-year-olds of Mandaloun and Midnight Bourbon. I would say the Louisiana definitely didn't disappoint, and neither did the Lecomte, producing an exciting finish, one that I know both of us were pretty pleased about.
Yeah, it was a really good day of racing. I thought it turned out pretty well for forecast listeners, and just as a racing fan in general, it was nice to see Mandaloun. Who knows if he's going to eventually be the Kentucky Derby winner, but he's racing again as a 4-year-old, and whether he is that or not, he's going to be a force to deal with.
Yeah, we're going to go over that fairgrounds card, talk about 5 of the stakes races from Saturday, then we'll move on to Aqueduct, recap some of the racing there from this past weekend, talk a little bit about how the track bias that we saw last week affected those results of the races we are going to discuss, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about a couple races from Santa Anita and some maiden and allowance events from Oaklawn and Parks to close out the show. But as I said, we're going to begin things at fairgrounds, and let's start with that return of Mandaloun, Craig, in Louisiana. Obviously, this was the biggest speed figure of last week, and not really a surprise there. Mandaloun was one of the top horses in the country last year. We just didn't get to see him for the second half of the season after he gutted out a victory over Hot Rod Charlie. Guys, I should say, got put up by disqualification in that gutsy performance in the Haskell last year. Mandaloun returning as a 4-year-old, I think he did what he was supposed to do.
He did. I thought he looked good doing it. I mean, there were some questions if he'd be fully cranked up, and it's hard to say if he was or wasn't, but he was able to beat Midnight Bourbon by 3/4 of a length. Personally, I'd be interested in your take. I had no doubt turning for home he was going to wear him down. It just knowing Midnight Bourbon's tendencies and just seeing the way Mandaloun was ridden, I kind of figured he had his measure, and I think he was even better than the 3/4 length margin indicates. He's going to get about, I would guess, a 126 TimeformUS speed figures. I'll have the official Saturday figures a little bit later today, but it looks like a pretty simple card to do, and we're going to talk about a couple of the other routes as well. The figures are probably all going to use the same speed variant, so I have no problem saying that 126 is going to be right there, give or take a point.
Yeah, I agree. Watching this race, it seemed like Mandaloun just always had Midnight Bourbon measured. He was traveling really sweetly down the backstretch under Florent Geroux. In the past, Mandaloun has gotten a little too keen early in his races, and he's tugged on the rider a bit too much, but I thought he was kind of just under that threshold this time. He was keen, but he seemed to always be within Florent's control, and once they got into the stretch, he just pounced on Midnight Bourbon, and that rival was never coming back on him. I was tweeting about this after the race. I'm not sure that Midnight Bourbon is a hanger so much as he's just not quite as good as some of the top 3-year-olds out there. I mean, horses like Essential Quality and Mandaloun and even Hot Rod Charlie, they just have seemed to have his measure in every race, and maybe they just need to set their sights a little bit lower with Midnight Bourbon because he's a really nice horse. It just seems like maybe he's not going to find his chance to shine on these Grade 1 events. Not that this was a Grade 1 race, but he was facing a Grade 1 rival at Mandaloun.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I have no doubt if Mandaloun hadn't showed up, he would have won this race. Nobody was close to him at the finish, and I don't think he would have found a way to lose it. It's just he ran into a better horse. I've seen a lot of talk about him maybe being a one-turn horse. I don't know if I buy that. I mean, maybe he'd be better at one turn, but I think I saw you mention it on Twitter. Where's he going to go? The Met Mile and run into horses like Life is Good or Flightline? He's not at their level. And there's just not as many opportunities at the high class of racing. I think maybe if they're just a little more judicious picking some spots, he's going to win a big race at one of these points. But so far, he just, like you said, keeps running into horses that are just a little bit better than him.
No, I think they could have a big campaign as a 4-year-old with this horse. They just have to pick their spots a bit more carefully. Like maybe a race like the Charlestown Classic is a good one to point to for Midnight Bourbon because he's got the tactical speed that can be successful over that track. There's a big pot, and it often doesn't attract the best horses in the division. So I think that there is a route to travel with Midnight Bourbon. Doesn't sound like they're planning on traveling it, though, because I know there's a lot of talk about both of these horses, Mandaloun and Midnight Bourbon, traveling over to the Middle East to compete in the Saudi Cup. I know that a lot of connections have trouble resisting the urge to go over there with the big purse on the line. I'm never a big fan of us losing the chance to see more of our top horses in this country, but we'll see how they do over there if the connections do decide to send them. But I thought they both made a nice return to the races as a 4-year-old. And one thing I do want to note before we move on from this race, Craig, is the pace of this race. It was pretty even throughout. They kind of went slowly for the first quarter and half mile, and they really sprinted home at the end. And it's worth talking about that in comparison to the Lecomte, which we're going to mention next, because the Lecomte had a very different pace scenario than this Louisiana Stakes over the same distance, whereas they went much faster early in the Lecomte, and the field definitely was tiring in the late stages, and I think that allowed the race to kind of fall apart as it did, which gave Call Me Midnight, the eventual winner, the chance to get up and cause a big upset.
Yeah, it was quite a difference. Just quickly on the Louisiana, as you said, the pace was pretty moderate. They flew home. That's what made it even more impressive for Mandaloun for me. He was able to make up that ground on Midnight Bourbon. Not sure if the figures will be coded in blue. I tend to doubt it. It wasn't as slow as, slow enough to cause that blue coating, but it was highly moderate at best. It wasn't a fast pace. What was a fast pace was that Lecomte, for sure. This will be coded in red at all the calls. And I thought the top two both ran really good races in here. I know both of us were rooting for Call Me Midnight. It was a very close photo. But yeah, he was able to get up. Got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure. I believe Epicenter is going to get 3 or 4 points higher than him for setting that fast pace and holding on until the very last stride. I don't think he certainly didn't lose anything in defeat. He's one that I think is moving in the right direction and has every right to be a top 3-year-old, because like I said, his figure's going to be in the 113 range, and it was just his 4th start. So good effort from them. Papa Cap, he just kind of ran what he's been running. I'm not sure if how much room there is to grow with this one. He's raced more. He just kind of runs even races. He's a good horse, don't get me wrong, but he's not the kind of horse that I want going forward.
Yeah, when you pick a horse like Call Me Midnight, you know that there's the potential for him to improve, but you also recognize that he's not the most likely winner of the race, and he's going to need a lot of things to go right for him. And I thought on the forecast, both of us kind of highlighted the fact that we thought this race could come apart because it just seemed like there was so much speed on paper that even if Epicenter got to the front, he was going to have to be pressured in doing so, and that's exactly how the race played out. And I thought that James Graham did a masterful job on Call Me Midnight of just not getting too concerned about dropping too far off the pace. He really let the first pack of runners get away from him on the backstretch. He was really off the screen for the entire race, but you could see when Call Me Midnight came back into the shot at the quarter pole that he was just traveling so nicely. He hadn't been asked yet, and James Graham saved ground on the turn, angled out at the top of the stretch just the way that you want to, and he was able to time it perfectly to get up right on the wire. I think he really only stuck his head in front on that final jump as they crossed the finish line, but that was the right time to do it, and he's the kind of horse that he had some nice races coming into this, but I think that Kentucky Jockey Club had really dirtied up his form, and the public just completely went off him here at 28-1. I didn't think we'd get that big of a price on him, but he really was not the kind of runner that they wanted to latch onto, whereas Epicenter and Papa Cap did take all the money. And I agree, Craig. I think Epicenter probably ran the best race here, setting that fast pace and nearly hanging on at the end. I thought it was a really gutsy performance by him. Papa Cap, yeah, I have the same thoughts as you. I thought that he got a decent trip. He just didn't really have that finishing kick to forge past even Epicenter in the stretch of this race. And I think Papa Cap's performance, it calls into question the strength of that Breeders' Cup Juvenile from last year. I know without Jack Christopher competing in that race, there's a bit of a question about what Corniche was beating. And I wonder if he's really going to be the top 3-year-old when he returns. We'll see in whoever's barn or wherever Bob Baffert decides to run it if he's still with him. But I'm not sure that the top 3-year-olds this year are necessarily going to come out of that Breeders' Cup Juvenile.
Yeah, and it's a little early. I don't want to make people think that I think this was what we would consider a top 3-year-old prep. A 109 for the winner, it's a decent figure, but it's nothing to get overly excited about. It's just a grade 3 in early January. So all of these horses would have to continue to move forward and run faster to be true contenders as we move forward. But there's certainly some potential there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think either of us are saying that Call Me Midnight and Epicenter are our Kentucky Derby horses this long way out. They both have a lot of further improving to do. But this is a crop where we haven't seen anybody run a breakout speed figure yet, so it definitely puts them in the conversation, even though they just ran a number around 109. Let's move on to the Silver Bullet Day for the 3-year-old fillies. Oaks Prep a long way out, and this one was won by the favorite Lecomte, who led the entire way. Well, I shouldn't say the entire way, because she actually did lose the lead for a portion of the stretch drive, but she did come back to win this race over her main pace rival, Fannie and Freddie. This one, though, Craig, not nearly as fast as the Lecomte, and it seems like these fillies are really going to have to run a lot faster in the future if they're going to be major Oaks contenders.
Yeah, I know I've mentioned before on the show, I very rarely look at buyer speed figures. If I see them, I see them. I haven't seen one, but this is one I did mean to look up. So when I'm done, if you happen to know it, please let me know. But
yeah, buyer gave it a 74.
Okay, I gave this race just an 89, which is even slower than what buyer did. I'm not sure how he did the figures. I haven't looked and probably won't, but I don't think there's any doubt it was a slow race. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one other than Lecomte had everything go her own way and was able to battle back. And honestly, when I was watching live, I know we talked about on the forecast, I had her singled, so I wanted her to win. And I had a feeling she was going to come back, just watching visually, but it was not a pretty race, and I don't want any of these going forward.
Yeah, like you said, she really did have things her own way on the front end. Nobody was pressuring her in the early stages of this race. I mean, Fannie and Freddie was stalking her in second, but Colby Hernandez wasn't necessarily asking her to apply any pressure on the backstretch, and she did give up the lead in upper stretch. But like you said, it seemed like Joel Rosario, he hadn't quite pushed the button on her yet. He can be a little cagey like that, and he did leave just enough in the tank to come back in the late stages, but they were not flying through the stretch of this race. It's actually maybe an indictment of some of the runners in behind them that they didn't make up more ground because they were not coming home that fast at the end. And just feels like there are going to be better 3-year-old fillies out there. Obviously, Lecomte can improve as her sister Clairiere did last year. That's one who just kept getting better with racing throughout the spring and summer. But Lecomte has a long way to go. She's going to start earning the kinds of speed figures that make her a Kentucky Oaks contender.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd say about that, Clairiere had a completely different running style. And one thing, maybe I'm off base, but just one thing I've noticed in my long time following horse racing and is that horses who show speed don't seem to improve as much as those who kind of goof around early and come running late. Those seem to have a little more upside. The front runners, you kind of tend to know what they have. Not that they don't improve their speed figures, because they do, but I just think there's more room to grow for the closers.
Move on to a couple of the turf stakes from Fairgrounds on Saturday. The Colonel E.R. Bradley was contested over 1 1/16 on that grass course for the older males, and a bit of an upset in this one, Craig, as Mike Maker was able to win this race with one of his entrants at 16-1 with 40 under. I've got to say, the most surprising part of this race to me, Craig, was that Two Emmys was able to make the lead, because it seemed like there were a lot of other faster speed horses in this race. They just weren't ridden that way.
Yeah, that was a bit perplexing, and I think it helped 40 Under. You could say 40 Under was one of those horses, but he actually got a great ride. He just sat off the flank at Two Emmys. The pace was nothing special, as you say. I'm not sure what horses like Dynamite and Bodie Cream, why they were in the race if they weren't going to go. And honestly, I'm a little bitter, because this one cost me the pick 4. I wound up not playing the pick 5, but I did play a pick 4, and somehow I missed it with a long shot and 2 singles, right? This is the race I got wrong. But I would say Halo again just wasn't good enough, though. 40 Under, he got a nice trip, but he did it because he has good tactical speed. He got a very good ride from Mitchell Morrill, and he just was able to gut it out to the wire. It was a smart ride. He sat just off that speed, sensing that the pace wasn't anything special. There was no reason to go on with it, and he was able to gut it out. I would say Two Emmys was a little bit disappointing, but I think it's kind of what we both expected. It was more a prep, as our guest Marcus Hirsch pointed out, and I would expect him to run much better next time.
The one thing I can say about the horses coming out of that Diliberto Memorial, which this is not a red board because I said on the show last week that I did not like the horses coming out of this race. So, I mean, I was totally off base in this one. But the one thing that I can say in retrospect is that there was really no reason for Halo again to be 7-2 and for 40 under to be 16-1 because they basically hit the wire together last time. And Halo again was the one who had saved a lot more ground that day. So you could make the argument that 40 under had run just as well in that race. He got the right trip in here, as you said. He was right on top of what was a pretty moderate pace set by two Emmys. I saw Marcus tweeting throughout the day at the fairgrounds that maybe you did not want to be right on top of the rail on the turf course, kind of counterintuitive to what we said might happen. And we were talking on the forecast last week. You saw some horses early in the day that were right down on the rail, not really finding a whole lot in the stretch. So you did see in some of these races riders trying to avoid that inside path. So maybe being on the outside the entire way did help 40 under a little bit and worked against a horse like two Emmys. You'd have to watch more of the races to really be sure about that. Halo again, he was closing down the center of the track, just got turned away at the end of this race. I'm not going to say there was a big excuse for anybody finishing in behind them. The horse that I liked, Own Agenda, saved ground much of the way, but really just had no punch through the stretch. So I feel like the top three, they ran nice races. Two Emmys, probably the best horse coming out of this one and seems most likely to benefit from this run. Moving on to one more turf stakes that we'll discuss from the fairgrounds before we move on to some other venues, and that was the Duncan F. Kenner going 5.5 furlongs a little bit earlier in the card. This one was won, as in won by crossing the wire first, by Just Might, who was crossing the wire first in his 7th out of his last 8 starts in a row. So he really has done a lot of winning lately, but the stewards did not allow him to keep that victory as they took it away from him for infraction at the start. And Craig, I don't think we have a whole lot to say about the performance of Just Might because he ran the race that he usually runs. No surprise, he went off at even money. The big discussion point in this race was the disqualification, and it's the kind of disqualification that I hate to see, whether or not the infraction really rose to that level. You just hate to see the bettors screwed out of a score when a horse was so much the best.
Yeah, he ran a really nice race. He's going to get a 123 or so Timeform US speed figure for the win, which is just what he had run last time. And I say win, obviously, with air quotes. He's a horse who's just... He can run well on either surface. He runs 120 speed figures on dirt, does it on turf. He wins on both, so he's really versatile. I got to tell you, I didn't watch this race live. I was out earlier and got home in time for the pick 5. And when I saw all the outrage on Twitter, I said, oh no, here we go. But I'll be honest, watching it, I could go either way on this one. I can see the reason for the DQ. I probably wouldn't have made it personally, but I can't get too upset about it. I mean, I do think he caused some problems.
Yeah, my take on it is if you're going to consistently DQ horses for problems coming out of the starting gate or in the first furlong of a race, then it makes sense. I mean, this was an infraction. I don't think you could watch it and say that something didn't happen and that Colby Hernandez on Just Might didn't cause it because he's the one that came over all those paths. And you could see on the head-on, he didn't even look until after the incident was happening. So not a good look for the rider. However, this horse was much the best. He was never losing this race. I mean, Sir Alfred James, who was most compromised in finishing last, yes, he probably was cost some positions, but do you really want to do that to the bettors, to take a horse that was so much the best and place him last? Is that the right way to adjudicate these situations, or is it better to just find the rider who's the one who caused the situation? I prefer not to see disqualifications in situations like this, but that's just my personal take. I know some people disagree with me. I think less disqualifications is better for the people wagering on the product, but that's just the way that I view these situations. All that aside, Just Might ran a really nice race, Craig. He's a horse that's benefited from some moderate to slow paces in the past, so he hasn't always achieved the highest Timeform US speed figures, but the 123 preliminary number that I saw you send over to me for this race, that's among the highest numbers that I think we've seen out of Just Might.
Yeah, it's what he ran last time on the turf. I think he had run a 121 on the dirt before, back when I said, let's keep this horse on the dirt. But he's went back and forth being able to prove he can do it. And he's got a good future. I mean, he's obviously an older horse. It's not like he's going to be around forever. He's a 6-year-old gelding. So there's no reason to think he's going anywhere. He looks like he should be at his peak right now. now, and I expect a good year from him. He would be a fun horse to own, as you could probably map out a pretty ambitious campaign, because he's also one that seems to be very sturdy. This was his 33rd career start. There's not very many layoff lines in his career, if any at all. I don't remember seeing any looking back, so he's a true warrior.
Yeah, I think I saw Marcus write something either on Twitter or in an article on DRF that the connections were toying with the idea of trying the Dubai Turf Sprint, maybe the Maidan Sprint is what it's called, on Dubai World Cup night, the race that I think Extravagant Kid won last year. So Americans can win that race. We'll see if that's the right spot for Just Might, but he's certainly in the kind of form where, like you said, they could try in a more ambitious spot with him. Move on to Aqueduct and talk about a few races there from last weekend, beginning with the feature race from Saturday, the Jazzle Stakes, going the 2-turn mile and an eighth. This one was won by First Constitution, who was achieving his first victory in the U.S. since coming north from South America and into the Todd Pletcher barn last season. Though, Craig, this race and really all of the races this past weekend at Aqueduct were significantly affected by the way the track was playing.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk more about that to me, because as I kind of posted on Twitter, I get turned off by tracks like this after a while. I know a lot of people try to tell you you need to take advantage of them, but personally, I never find it that easy. I'm not doubting there's some smarter people out there than me, but I just see a lot of races where you can't predict who's going to be on the rail in these races. It's one thing to try to predict the leader. It's another to try to predict who's going to save ground. And oftentimes it comes down to the jockey and how aware they are. I know we saw a few who seem to be very aware. We saw a few who seem to be clueless, but that's just not the kind of racing for me. So I watch these as a fan, and I hope to use them in the future. I will certainly make extensive trip notes, note who was able to be on the best part of the track, who probably ran not as well as it's going to look. And there's going to be a lot of horses I'm sure we'll see on your Horses to Watch segment that were running into the teeth of the bias and able to run well. So I kind of take these results with a grain of salt. First Constitution probably won this race at the post position draw, as his main rival was Core Conviction, who wound up finishing last. But just as an example, I would downgrade First Constitution next out. He's going to run about a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a very good stakes type number. I mean, it's only 2 points below what we saw Mandaloon run, but in no way would I put him in that same kind of category as him. Whereas a horse like Core Conviction, I'd probably give another chance, as he was 2-3 wide, pressing the pace all the way around, had every right to give it up. So I think there's going to be a lot of races from the past week to talk about. And I also tweeted when I made the speed figures for Sunday, there's no real change at Aqueduct, in that it's not unusual to see big changes in the track speed. There were actually 2 of them. A couple of the early races where it was really slow. Then the track got faster for a few races. Then it got to actually be more like a normal track for the rest of the card. So my take on that is the track superintendent, who I know is one of the best in the business. I think his name's Glenn Kozak. I actually met him a while back. I think they're trying to fix it, but sometimes you can't overcome the weather, and I suspect that's what's happening.
Yeah, just to kind of plainly state what Craig is referring to there, in case you weren't following Aptitude very closely last week, there was a significant rail bias, and horses that were on the rail seemed to really be traveling in the best path, have a significant advantage against those who were even in the 2-path or 3-path, just not traveling in that rail path. It was that kind of rail bias where, unless you were right on top of the rail, you probably were not going to have your best chance. Some horses did overcome the bias, but they were horses that generally were superior to their foes, and we didn't even see that much of that happening this past weekend, especially not on the Saturday card, when it seemed like the bias was at its strongest. And it's not something that we've is new to us this winter at Aqueduct. We've been seeing a lot of these tracks. I think since the end of December, since racing returned from that Christmas break, we've probably had 6 or 7 of these rail bias tracks, not always as pronounced as we saw this past weekend at Aqueduct, but every day this week, even going back to that Thursday card prior to the Friday cancellation, it was a wet track that day, but once again, it was another rail bias. So it's a problem at Aqueduct. It's been a problem for a long time. You don't often see a track bias on the New York circuit persist for as long as this rail bias has held on. I wonder how much the track superintendent can do at this point, because we've been dealing with some very cold temperatures in the New York area. I know when the temperatures drop below freezing, there's a limit to how much they can do with the track. There's a limit to how much water they can put on the track because they'll be freezing, which could possibly exacerbate the problem. I'm not a track maintenance expert. I don't know exactly what they can do, but I really wonder how much control they do have. I also wonder how much of an impetus it is for them to really do something about it, because I know the biggest priority at this time of year for Glenn and all the other track maintenance superintendents is safety in the wintertime. You want to maintain a safe surface, and sometimes, the concerns of the horse players, whether the track is biased one way or the other, can be secondary in their consideration. So I wonder. And, I put out a poll on Twitter the other day about whether or not people do like tracks like this. Craig, I tend to side with you. I'm not a big fan of betting races on days like this. I'm a fan of handicapping horse races. I'm not a fan of handicapping just the first eighth of a mile of horse races to determine who's going to get to the front in the rail. That's not so fun for me. I'm not a big fan of just merely handicapping the jockeys to see which ones are paying attention versus not. I like when the races are a little bit less predictable. And I think what you find on days like this is that the races do end up becoming more predictable. And we saw that on Sunday, where there was just this parade of favorites. And it was like, the races already looked pretty formful, but the public figured out which of the horses with form were going to be able to get to the front in the rail, and they just kept betting those horses and they kept winning. So, if you like days like that where the races are predictable, then have at it. But I like when there's a little bit more chaos, a bit more complexity to the racing. So I'm not a big fan of these rail bias days, except for the fact that you do get to find some trips that you can bet back. And as Craig mentioned, I will be doing a horses to watch segment coming out tomorrow on Wednesday, where I'll be talking about some horses that were against the bias. But I do hope it's a situation that they can get sorted out, because you don't like to see these things persist forever. It hurts the connections too. Connections of closers, horses that figured it out, get outside trips. They're not getting a fair shake. So eventually, I feel like there are going to be consequences. So you do want to see the track change in the near future. But as for this Jazzle Stake, the first Constitution, Craig, I don't have a whole lot to add. He got the right trip. Core Conviction, who the public went for because they assumed he would be the controlling speed. He was not aggressively ridden enough by Jose Ortiz and kind of ceded the rail in the lead and sitting in the two path the entire way. That was never going to be successful, so he ended up backing up to finish last in this race. Core Conviction is a horse that I would certainly give another shot to, because I think the trip is what did him in. And First Constitution, as you said, Craig, a horse that I'd be looking to downgrade next time he runs.
Yeah, and the other thing we didn't mention is Jose Lezcano rid First Constitution. He was definitely one of the riders who seemed to me to be aware of the bias, although he's usually pretty aggressive anyway. But we also saw one of the consequences earlier in the week in a maiden race, where he was a little too aggressive trying to get to the rail and almost put another rider over the fence, in my opinion. I haven't heard if the stewards have done anything about it, but that's one of the byproducts of a strongly biased track like this, is you get some riders that might get a little bit careless out there.
No, I think that's a good point too. And you saw a lot of that happening on Saturday and Sunday. Riders just at all costs trying to get to the rail because they knew that that's the path they had to be in. And if they get a little bit too aggressive trying to cut over on each other, you can find yourself in some dangerous situations. Hopefully, thankfully there were no incidents that are really noteworthy or worth bringing up. But like you said, there was the possibility of having one in a race on Saturday. Crisis was averted there, but you don't want to see riders getting that close to crossing the line. Moving on to Sunday's card at Aqueduct, the future race then was the Busanda for the 3-year-old fillies. Another race with points towards the Kentucky Oaks, this one going the same distance as the Jazzle on Saturday, 1.1 miles on the main track around the two turns. And very similar situation, Craig. The horse that got to the front and the rail was the winner of this race, Magic Circle. No real surprise, because she was the even money favorite and figured to get that trip.
Yeah, she was the best horse coming in on paper. She drew the rail. She had speed. So for me, this is just more of a paid workout. She's going to get she did get a 105 TimeformUS speed figure. Nothing for me to get overly excited about. I assume this is a race, I think, that gives away some Oaks points, but it would be hard for me to imagine any of these horses being real Kentucky Oaks type contenders.
Yeah, I would say Magic Circle is a horse that probably doesn't really want to go the mile and an eighth, but I think she just had the best form coming in, and the track carried her some of the way, so it certainly helped. I do want to highlight the trip of the runner-up Morning Matcha, because she's one of the few horses that actually tried to beat the bias and was somewhat successful on this card. I mean, she was inside for about the first 3 furlongs of the race, but for the last 3/4 of a mile, Kendrick Carmouche had her out in the 2 to 3 path, trying to pass horses and chase, and that's the problem when you're riding a closer on one of these tracks. You can't always come up the rail in every race, so he had to go around some horses, and she was finishing best of all at the end, trying to come after Magic Circle, just basically ran out of ground at the end. So Morning Matcha might be the kind of horse that you want to upgrade coming out of this race, and we'll see. The next stop on the New York Trail to the Kentucky Oaks is the Busher, where they turn back to the one-turn mile, and I think they'll be right up the alley of Morning Matcha. You typically get some more pace in those one-turn races, so she's one that I would give another look to next time out. Moving on to another race from Sunday before we close things out at Aqueduct was an allowance race earlier in the day, won by Glass Ceiling. And Craig, I mean, I haven't seen your the entire set of speed figures for this card yet. I'm surprised to see this race just get a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. To me, it looked like a much faster race than that, and Glass Ceiling seems like a far classier horse than that speed figure. But I mean, she's just in great form right now for Charlton Baker, and she was a dominant winner of this race. I like seeing Charlie Baker have a good horse, and it seems like he's got one in very good form right now in Glass Ceiling.
Yeah, this was part of that tricky Aqueduct card on Sunday when it came to making speed figures. That's one I'm going to have to give a close look at, because one of the swing races was where I have it now between the third and the fourth. Had I used the same variant as the third, it would be a quicker race, so I'm still a little bit torn on that one. The fifth was a lightly raced maiden claiming race with very little to go on, so I may spend a little more time on that, because I'm not sure that 101's really representative. It was a oddly run race, and it was quick early, kind of probably because of that bias where everybody was trying to get position, and then it really slowed down to the half mile. On our pace figures, the half mile time is 16 points slower, and then Glass Ceiling just flew home. So I'm not sure what to make of that race. She had the field over a barrel, really. I don't think she had any competition. I was surprised she was as high as even money, to be honest. But interesting what she'll be able to do. She's one, I'm not sure what the ceiling is on her, to be a little bit punny. I think she is a stakes type competitor, and given the right trip, she could, maybe contend in a grade 3 type race.
Yeah, she's just been in great form recently. I mean, it took her a little while since Charlton Baker claimed her to kind of get on track, but the last 4 starts have just been awesome. I mean, she's been an open lengths winner 3 of those times, and the one loss 3 back in the Pumpkin Pie came to Lady Rocket, who came back and ran, you'll have to remind me what speed figure she got in winning the Gopher Wand on Cigar Mile Day, but I know it was in the mid 120s. It was very high. And Glass Ceiling, I mean, she almost beat her that day. So she's been in great form recently, and I know they're talking about targeting the Barbara Fritchie next time out at Laurel. I think that's the perfect kind of spot for a horse like this, because she likes the 7 furlongs, and she just seems like she's in great form right now. So you want to strike while the iron is hot.
Yeah, Lady Rocket have run a 125, so obviously a huge figure. And yeah, just since I am the speed figure guy, a little more talk. It's kind of what you run into on these days that are really tough, where the track's constantly changing. This one's tough, and I gotta say, as I'm looking at it as you were talking, I probably messed it up, but I will go back and change it. We'll see. I'll give it another look and kind of really look at that maiden race again, because that would have an effect as well. But it's one of those, it can be tough. So when you see these races at Aqueduct, if as a handicapper you see speed figures from me or Buyer or whoever that you happen to get speed figures from, don't be afraid to use your own opinion, because these are not easy days at all to come up with numbers for some of these races.
Yeah, and just one more thing I'll add to that conversation is you see a lot of horses running speed figures that are a little out of step with their prior form, and in those situations you do have to go back and say to yourself, well, was this horse one that was really helped by the bias? And we saw a lot of that race that you were just mentioning, Craig, that that cheaper claiming type that you might compare it to in the race prior, that was won by a horse that came up with a performance that you couldn't really have predicted based on form, but that was a horse that had never left the rail at any point of her trip under Trevor McCarthy, and was was able to beat a field that she seemed inferior to, but we saw a lot of that happening on Saturday and Sunday. Horses that didn't necessarily look like the best on paper, but if they stayed on the rail for every step of their trip, they're running new career tops. So it's difficult to make those comparisons sometimes when you don't have horses that were necessarily on the rail, comparing them to horses that were on the rail. Move on to Santa Anita and talk about a couple races from their last weekend. Their stakes race on Saturday was the Clocker's Corner, a turf sprint going 6 furlongs, and this one was won in pretty dominant fashion by Barraza, who is just a new horse since they have turned him back to sprinting on the turf.
Yeah, this was quite the effort. He took all the money at the windows. I don't think he looked quite as dominant on paper or on speed figures as he did at the betting windows, but it seems like they knew. What caught me by surprise is not so much that he won the races. He was obviously a contender in here, but this horse hadn't shown speed on the turf in quite some time. The one time he had led a turf race, it was actually going a mile and an eighth, which is obviously quite a bit different than 6 furlongs. But somehow Saturday, he was able to assume command right from the start. And once he did, the race was over. He's going to wind up with about a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, which will be a career best for him. And it wasn't a tough figure to make. Sometimes these turf sprints are a little tough because you don't get many of them, but they ran 4 of these on Saturday at the exact same distance of 6 furlongs, so it wasn't tough at all. I know one of your guests while I was gone over the summer was Emily Gullickson. I think you had her on a couple times, and she pointed out the trainer Vladimir Sirin has just been red hot at Santa Anita, and you know, for whatever reason, this horse was able to show a new dimension, which is going to make him pretty dangerous.
Yeah, Vladimir Sirin, also a trainer that seems to really excel in these turf sprints, and he's definitely gotten Barraza to run some of his best races since turning back to these shorter distances on the turf. He's kind of a funny horse when you look at all of his PPs. He began his career with Bob Baffert, and it is a rare horse that you saw claimed for $100,000. You don't see many 6-figure claims put in on horses, but his current connections did claim him for that sum back in April of last year, and they immediately put him on the turf. It seems like that's why they claimed him, to get onto the turf. Didn't work out in the routes initially, but turning back to sprints has really kind of made the light bulb go on, and he's always been well bred. He's buy into mischief. His dam Halo Dolly, she was a millionaire California bred who raced on the turf a number of years ago, I believe, for Jerry Hollendorfer, and just it seems like turning back to these sprints on the turf has really woken up Barraza, and I think you make a really good point, Craig, about the fact that he had been coming from off the pace on the turf, and he kind of ran that race here because he had a sprinter's finish, or I should say a closer's finish, but he did so off his own fraction, setting the pace. So he just gave nobody from the back of the pack a chance to get into this race because he was flying home to the stretch, but he did so after leading the whole way.
Yeah, and it wasn't like the pace was slow early. It wasn't. It was just kind of an even pace throughout. On the numbers actually ticks down a few points. So he's going to be a dangerous one. Something I always like to point out, he is a newly turned 4-year-old, so there's still definitely some room for him to grow, especially on turf, because these horses really seem to come to hand as they get later in that 4-year-old season and into 5, and as we've seen many times on the grass, even longer.
Let's move on to Sunday at Santa Anita, where the feature race there was an allowance race, the 8th on the card, non-winners of 1, optional claimer going a mile on the dirt, and pretty uncompetitive affair as the Bob Baffert trained Distracted Princess won her second start in a row, staying undefeated at 1-5 odds. Craig, we had talked about this filly's debut, I believe, a few weeks ago at Santa Anita, again, when she won as a very heavy favorite against inferior competition, and pretty much the same story here on the stretch out.
Yeah, I mean, it was not really a surprise. She went off 1-5 in here. She had won first time by 13 lengths. For this day on Sunday, she got a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, so she did step it up a little bit. I have to be honest, this isn't the kind of horse I get overly excited about. She's won 2 starts by 20 lengths, but she hasn't run particularly fast, and she is already a 4-year-old. It's not like she's a 3-year-old. She obviously had some issues, and to be a real player in the stakes division, she's going to have to still run quite a bit faster. Now, maybe she can, but for in my opinion, these are the kind, when they win this easily, they usually run fast doing so. So I'm not going to get overly excited about her.
Yeah, we're on the same page about this one. I feel like this is the horse that could start to pick up some steam and hype if they decide to try Stakes Company next time out. But she's just faced nothing of note in these past two races. I mean, it was basically a glorified maiden claiming race in her debut. And this one, I mean, you could check out some of the horses she was running against. They don't necessarily have graded stakes of their futures, let's put it that way. So Distracted Princess was just better than her competition on this day. She's not the most impressive horse to watch run. She just kind of gets it done. I don't know if she has a light mouth or something, but it seems like she's not the kind of horse you can handle that aggressively. She runs with her head turned a little bit. I just feel like maybe she might be a little overrated going into her next start, but she is a horse worth discussing because, like you said, she's one or two starts by 20 lengths. It just feels like she's going to get a much sterner test in the future. Let's move on to a maiden race from Oaklawn Park. I believe they ran a stakes on Saturday, but it came up pretty slow. The American Beauty for the sprinters, won by Miss Mosaic, so we're not going to talk about that. But one race that's notable from their Sunday card was actually the finale, race 9, won by the Steve Asmussen-trained Hot and Sultry. A pretty fast maiden race for the 3-year-old fillies at this time of year, Craig.
Yeah, what? She's going to get a 109 Timeform US speed figure, and it's not like there weren't plenty of races to compare it to. As you said, there was a stakes race earlier on the card, which ran in a pretty similar time, if memory serves. Maybe that was the day before, but got a similar speed. Yeah, got a similar speed figure, I should say. This was a big effort from Hot and Sultry. She had run decent enough first time out, especially for a 2-year-old. Ran a 98 Timeform US speed figure, but the horse who was behind her that day had already come back to win with a nice speed figure next time out. And it might have been on the same card, actually. And
yeah, it was another division of the same race,
not as
4 races earlier.
Yeah, not as fast as this one, but this one was impressive. Hot and Sultry was able to win it really easily. 109 speed figure, which that is big for a 3-year-old filly this time early in the year. So not sure what her distance limitations would be. I'll kind of leave that one to you, but she is fast, no doubt about that.
Yeah, she looks like a pure sprinter to me just from watching her run, and even based on the pedigree. She's by Speightster, who you don't often think as, getting top competition, or I should say expensive runners, but he definitely is a horse that can get, or a sire, I should say, that can get some win early types, and that seems like to be the case with Hot and Sultry. She did sell for nearly $500,000 as a yearling. Her dam has produced Tracksmith, who was a miler on the turf, but if you go a little deeper in the family, this is actually the female family of Extra Heat. Her second dam, Elusive Heat, was the best daughter of Extra Heat, a horse that had a very short career. She was very fast but fragile. I think she won 3 or 4 starts, ran a very fast speed figure for, I believe, Jimmy Toner at one point, but unfortunately she passed away prematurely. I think she only produced 1 foal, which was Hot and Sultry's dam. So a very fast female family, and I think we're going to see this one be pretty effective in sprints moving forward. Let's move on to Parks to close out this show. One more race, and we're going to stay with the 3-year-old fillies, as we saw one that probably was not on most people's radars last week. Just a race I wanted to highlight because it really stuck out among all the racing from Parks last week, and that was a Wednesday allowance race that was won by Divine Huntress. And just worth pointing out because, Craig, this filly, she didn't run that much slower than the one who got Oaks points in the Busan at Aqueduct.
No, she's actually going to wind up with a 103 time. Well, she did wind up with a 103 Timeform US speed figure, and this was a really visually impressive race. She's a filly who had been running well, but she really seemed to take the 2 turns. You don't often see a horse who was well off the pace early draw away to win by nearly 13 lengths. So I like everything I saw about what she did, the way she finished off her race, and I think she's probably got more in the tank than the 103. I don't want to be that person that says she could have run faster, but I think under different circumstances, she would have even had a better number in her. So she's one, obviously, I would think they're going to keep around the 2 turns because she pretty much blew me away.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a similar situation in one sense to Distracted Princess, because she won by 13 and was beating nothing. But I feel like Divine Huntress is a horse that nobody's going to be talking about, unlike with Distracted Princess, who has that flashy 2-for-2 resume and being in Bob Baffert's barn. Distracted Princess, I should note, is a 4-year-old, not a 3-year-old, whereas Divine Huntress will potentially be trying a race on the Kentucky Oaks Trail. You would imagine at some point off performance like this. A decent enough speed figure, as you said, the 103, and just a horse that it seems like really relished the distance of this race, the mile and a 16th. It was one of these days at Parks where the track was playing very slow. It seemed pretty dead. A lot of horses were struggling to finish, and she just powered right through it, drawing away with authority through the stretch. I mean, she took over so easily on the far turn. I think she was a private purchase coming out of her maiden victory back by Eclipse Thoroughbred Partners and Graham Motion, who now has her. So we'll see what they decide to do with her. She's by Divining Rod, who probably not a sire that's on most people's radars, but he's had a pretty good first crop in Maryland, and this is definitely the best runner that we've seen in this first crop. So I'll be interested to see what they decide to do with her next.
Yeah, good info on the private purchase. I was wondering, I saw the trainer change, obviously, to Graham Motion from someone, frankly, I'm not familiar with, that is kind of low rated. I don't really knock trainers because of that, but pretty much anybody to Graham Motion is going to be an upgrade, probably in 98% of the cases. So he has a good one on his hands, and I'll be adding her to my stable mail to see where she's going to pop up next.
Well, that's all the racing to recap from this past week, Craig. It is an exciting week in racing, though, currently, as we're looking ahead to next weekend. And on Saturday at Gulfstream Park, they will be running the Pegasus World Cup and the Pegasus World Cup card, where they got a few of those Grade 1 events, really a slate of stakes racing for the second half of that card. Some big turf races, going the longer distances, the Pegasus World Cup turf, the Pegasus World Cup filly and mare turf. I know they've added some of those in recent years, but the headline attraction is going to be Knicks Go versus Life is Good. So we'll be handicapping a lot of that later this week on Friday, and we'll be having a guest on to help us with that.
Yeah, Barry Spears of Twitter fame is going to be on. He also does his own podcast, Going in Circles with Chuck Simon. That one comes out on Tuesday. It's one of the several that I listen to as I drive around Oklahoma City during the week. So I honestly, I'll be the first to admit, I don't know a whole lot about Barry's handicapping style. So we've had Chuck Simon on. I had him on as a guest when you were out, and I look forward to hearing what Barry has to say.
Well, I'll be doing a live stream later this week on Thursday night, if you want to check that out on DRF's, I think, Facebook and YouTube channel. That'll be going live at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll be handicapping a lot of these Pegasus World Cup races. So when we get to the forecast the next day, I'm going to mostly turn it over to you guys. I'll be on the show, but I want to hear how Barry's going to handicap this card, and you as well, Craig. So look forward to that, which will be coming out on Friday afternoon, the TimeformUS forecast. Everybody, remember, you can listen to these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.